Good to have you with us. Let's open our Bibles tonight to Genesis chapter 46. We have 3 more studies after tonight to spend in Genesis, and then we're going to start a very slow walk through the book of Ephesians. But I think you all are ready for it. You're thinkers, right? You like theology. You want to get it in your heads. 3 chapters of filling your mind with the promises of God, and then 3 chapters of, all right, now what are you going to do with it? So we're looking forward to that as well. But we're going to continue our studies through this book of beginnings and continue with Joseph, who is a wonderful example to us, if you've been with us, of Romans 8:28. That the Lord said through Paul, we know that all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are the called according to his purpose. And how trusting the Lord when you don't understand his ways is a life of faith that brings the greatest blessings to your life. And it'll leave you in a place of rest. For the last time, I'm going to give you a 5-minute overview. You should probably be able to do this by now. I hope you can. We have been following the life of Joseph for quite some time. He was 17 years old when he was sold by his brothers into slavery. They were jealous of him for his father's love and for the fact that he had a couple dreams about one day that they would bow before him. He would be their master. They would be his servants. It didn't go over too well with these young men. And so he was sold by them. First they thought about killing him, but Reuben talked them out of that. Judah thought, well, then let's sell him, get some money. And they did. 20 pieces of silver. And they sold him into what would become a house of a fellow named Potiphar, who was a captain in Pharaoh's army. And Joseph would be in that house as a servant for 10 years. Imagine 17 years old, you're moved so many miles from home, forced to be a servant in someone else's home. And just imagine what went through his head. But this was a young man who knew the Lord. And so he was as faithful as he could be in the place that God put him. And as a result, God began to bless Joseph. Everything he laid his hands on, it was blessed. Potiphar recognized it as well. It wasn't long before he made Joseph the head of all of his house. And he served there, like I said, year after year. Imagine 10 years of this captivity. Unfortunately, Mrs. Potiphar took a liking to Joseph, would oftentimes kind of make a move on him. He pushed them aside, but one day she caught him in the house by herself, no servants around, and she kind of grabbed hold of him and tore off his coat as he went running out of the house, and she yelled rape and accused him of something he didn't do. Her husband could have had him killed. He didn't, but they did put him into prison, and at 28 years old or so, Joseph would spend the next 2 to 3 years in jail for something he didn't do. And again, faithful to the Lord. I mean, this, talk about a dysfunctional place for your life to be. Joseph had every reason to cry out, I can't do this. But he trusted that the Lord was doing what he wanted, though I'm sure that if you had stopped him anywhere along those chapters that we've been reading, there would be no way he could explain to you what was going on. He was faithful there. The head of the prison took note. They put Joseph in charge. And all of the prisoners went to Joseph, where they checked in with him. He was responsible for them. And for the better part of 3 years, Joseph waited upon the Lord there. He celebrated his 30th birthday in prison. He was given in charge at some point over Pharaoh's butler and his baker. They had apparently tried to kill him, maybe. They were both accused. They both had a dream. They both came to Joseph. God gave to Joseph the understanding, and the butler was to be released. He was declared innocent, and the baker was to lose his head. And just like Joseph had said, it was exactly that way. And so Joseph said to the butler as he was getting out, could you put in the good word with me for Pharaoh? I haven't done anything wrong here, and I've been here now almost 2 years. And if you could just, share with him, I'd like to talk to him. But like most people, the butler gets out, he's just happy with himself, and he's gone, he forgets. Until one night the Pharaoh has a frightening dream, actually a couple of them, and none of his magicians could help him. And then came this cry from the butler, hey, there's a guy in prison. He interprets dreams. God used him. And what he said was exactly right. Go get Joseph. And that day, God brought Joseph out of prison, and he was brought to the forefront, and he stood before Pharaoh and interpreted his 2 dreams. One of them, that there would be 7 tremendous years of plenty, followed by 7 years of tremendous famine. And Joseph said, the Lord showed you what's coming ahead. So here's what I would advise you to do, Pharaoh. Plan ahead. Start saving up. Store away the food for the years of want. And Pharaoh saw Joseph's and God's hand upon Joseph, and he very quickly made him second in charge. And in one day, he went from prisoner number whatever to second in charge of the world. This was a world empire, the Egyptian rule. 7 years of plenty followed. Joseph is now 37 years old. He is married. He has been given 2 children by the Lord. He names them Manasseh and Ephraim. Manasseh means literally amnesia. Ephraim means ambrosia. Literally, he said, God has made me forget my sorrows and made me fruitful instead. Those were really the names of his 2 children. And so Joseph lets us in again on how hard it's been to be Joseph. And yet, at every place, he's been faithful. When the famine began to be intense in the second year of those second 7-year periods, if you will, Joseph's brothers lived in Canaan, 265 miles away, and they needed food. So Jacob, Joseph's father, said, here's some money, go get some food, we're starving. And the boys traveled there. They came together, 10 of them, but they didn't bring Benjamin along. Benjamin is now Jacob's favorite. It was Joseph's only natural brother through Rachel, his mother. And so when they showed up, imagine Joseph recognized them. They didn't recognize him. And that story begins in chapter 42. And as Joseph begins to examine his brothers, he really has a couple things in mind. He wants to know if his dad's all right. He wants to know if Benjamin's being as mistreated as he's been, or as he was. And he wants to know if the bros are at all sorrowful over what they had done and putting him up for sale and then lying to their father and saying he had died and causing him so much grief. He accuses them of being spies, puts them all in jail for 3 days, as they had done to Joseph earlier. They had put him there and sold him, if you will. And Joseph went out and he wept. He couldn't handle seeing his brothers and wanting so much to know what was going on. He decided after 3 days, he said he was going to keep everybody. He decided to keep Simeon. He sent everyone home with food, grain, and he put the money back in the bags. The boys headed home, stopped to feed the donkeys, found out at least in one of the bags there was money. By the time they got home, everybody had their money back, and man, now they're all kinds of worried. They tell Jacob exactly what had come on, and Joseph had said in sending them back, if you want any more food, you ever want to see my face again, you bring Benjamin with you next time. And oh man, that couldn't have gone worse for Jacob hearing those news. They discovered the money, he heard the demands, and he just said this, okay, I've lost Joseph. I'll be happy and okay. No, he didn't say I'd be happy. I can suffer with losing Simeon, but they're not getting Benjamin. He is going nowhere now. And so that was the end of it, but the famine continued. And so whether it was a couple months later, we don't know, but certainly the famine was just more severe. They ran out of food. And again, Jacob, go get some more food. Here's some more money. And they said, we can't. He won't even see us without Benjamin. Well, why did you tell him about Benjamin? Well, he asked. Well, why'd you have to tell him everything? Because he asked. I mean, we're the ones in a foreign country trying to get some help. And Jacob realizes he's in trouble. He does the old Jacob thing. He buys very expensive things to send to Pharaoh, hoping to smooth things over. But then he just kind of says, Lord, I give this into your hands. If I have to be grieved, I will. And so there's that struggle with Jacob in his heart. Again, the boys go back 265 miles. Again, they're brought into Joseph's presence, but he's not there. But he's told his caretaker to take him to my house. And so the boys are brought into the house, and they began to do this. It's about the money, isn't it? They're going to accuse us of stealing the money. So they said to the caretaker, "Look, we didn't steal any money. It was in our bags." And they tried to make a friend out of Joseph's, a friend, if you will. But he said, "No, we have your money. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe your God has blessed you." So Joseph comes home at lunch. He longs to hug his brother. He sees him sitting there. He sets them down for lunch in terms of age, which is interesting. And he feeds them all, but Benjamin, his natural brother, he gives 5 times the food everybody else gets. In chapter 44, he sends them home again with grain and money in their sacks, but this time he hides his silver cup in Benjamin's backpack or sack, and then a little later sends the soldiers back to accuse them of stealing. And when they finally discover, as they go from oldest to youngest again, this cup in Benjamin's sack, that the soldiers say, "You guys go home. We don't need everybody. We're going to take Benjamin back to answer for his sin, so to speak." And they said, No. We'll all go together. And it proved a lot to Joseph that these boys, rather than hating Benjamin as they had treated Joseph, now were willing to love their father and even put their own lives on the line to be sure he didn't suffer the loss of his favorite son. And so we read last week Judah's amazing words of intercession for Benjamin, and about how his father would suffer and how old he was, and this was all that Jacob could take. There wasn't any jealousy. There was great love for the dad and remorse for their sin. And finally, last week in chapter 45, Joseph just couldn't take it anymore. All those questions had been answered. And so he reveals himself to them and he comforts them, and he tells them some amazing things. Verse 5 of the last chapter, he said, "You sold me, but God sent me. You wanted to get rid of me, but God had a plan." And then he said in verse 7, "He sent me here to save." You sold, he sent, so that he might save. So Joseph's only desire now is to see his father, Jacob. Can you go get dad? And he said, "Don't bother bringing your old furniture. We got good furniture here." And he speaks to Pharaoh, who with his approval gives him clothes and money. And Benjamin got, again, far more than everyone else. And then they put him into the Egyptian limos, the new carts, for the trip. 265 miles back again. They returned to tell Joseph the good news, and it almost killed him. In fact, the last couple of verses of chapter 45, where we ended last week, showed Joseph it said he went like stone-eyed. He just, it took him aback. Well, tonight we'd like to look at chapter 46 and 47. I won't have to do that introduction anymore, so I hope you'll remember all of that. And we want to look at the great reunion between Joseph and his father as God more clearly continues to make known to Joseph why he had spent all of these years going through such difficulty. Now 22 years in all, where he just had no answers for his suffering, falsely accused, locked up as a slave, and now finally exalted by the Lord to this position in Egypt. One lesson I think that we have to take away from the life of Joseph is the ability, or asking the Lord for the ability to rest in God's person, who he is, and in God's promises. You know who God is. You know what he's like. And when your mind and your understanding fail to provide adequate reasons for your circumstance, you have to fall back on what you do know. Pastor Chuck used to say, when I don't know, let me fall back on what I do know. And then to go through this list. God is good. God is for me and not against me. God will finish the work that he started. God has a good plan. And he just began to lay out all the things I do know. And for Joseph, I think that was a survival. He hung on to what he did know and had a lot of things to face that he didn't know. I have a large file in my brain that has a label on it. It says, waiting for more information. And I must tell you, the longer I live, the fatter that thing becomes. There are things I absolutely don't understand about how God works. I can't wrap my head around them. I don't have the full picture. I might never have it on this side of glory, but I have one. And I think the adventure for me is having a file like that while still trusting in the Lord. I don't have a lot of answers. A lot of things I don't know. There's a lot of things I've learned that allow me to have that file without being stumbled by it. I mean, Joseph's brothers hated him. His faithfulness was rewarded with false accusation. His so-called friends that he served forgot him. He spent years in prison, and for what? And Joseph is not really able to clear those things out, that file. I suspect he had the same file, waiting for more information. But he rests anyway. He rejoices anyway. He's a true man of God who shows There is a great glory in being convinced of the providence of God's dealing with you and finding victory and hope and rest. Jacob, on the other hand, Dad, didn't have one of those files, I don't think. Because everything that goes wrong with Jacob brings a tremendous shaking into his life. Every situation that doesn't work out in his favor tends to floor him. And he's left a lot of times with very little confidence or joy. Joseph just plugging along, 22 years. Jacob seems to fall apart at everything. He becomes a whiner, right? A woe is me, the whole world is against me kind of guy. But one day, even for Jacob, he'll find out that God had a plan. It'll be a good revelation. But he will have lived 22 years of constant frustration. Whereas Joseph, though it has broken his heart, lives 22 years of confidence and rest. I would say to you, keep a file. Put in there everything that you don't understand, but in the meantime, trust the Lord who rules over all. Not everything is explained in this life. But like Joseph, hindsight is usually pretty good. You get to look back and go, wow, the Lord had, it's great to see. We've had some weird things happen in our life, and you don't know what you're going through at the time, but looking back, you go, wow, that was really good. Hindsight. I remember hearing a story that I think about when we talk about this subject of a mom, and she had a 7-year-old son who was taking piano lessons, and they were in Poland, and the mom got a chance to take her 7-year-old son to listen to Paderewski play. He was one of the masters of the piano in the 1860s. I think he died in the early 1940s. But the guy was phenomenal as a pianist. So mom got there early. They got to their seats. They were in the very front row. She couldn't have been happier. She was hoping her son would enjoy it. And some friends were behind her, so she turned around to talk to them. And when she turned around to talk to her son, he was gone. And he had snuck in through the no admittance sign on the side of the stage, but he couldn't read no admittance. He didn't know it. I think I'll just go that way. When the lights dimmed, she turned, and to her horror, the curtain came up, and there's this beautiful piano sitting right in the middle of a stage, and at it sat her 7-year-old boy, playing the only song he knew, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. She panicked. And then she saw Ignacio Paderewski walking out to his piano, dressed up with his tails and all, and he whispered in the boy's ear to keep playing. He put his left arm around him and began to play some of the bass notes to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And then he put his right hand around him to the other side and began to play these quick obligatos on the treble keys. And it sounded beautiful. And boy, whatever he was playing, the boy looked pretty good too. It brought the house down, a standing ovation. The master and the novice were playing together. Kind of you and me and the Lord. You're playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But if his arms are wrapped around you, he can make some beautiful music with you. And he'll do great things in your life. And Joseph saw that, and it kept him going. And for the next and last 17 years of Jacob's life, he would learn that too. Because from where we are forward, he'll die in 17 years. Verse 1. I knew we'd get there eventually. Sorry. I'll skip a bunch in a little while. We'll be fine. So Israel took his journey with all that he had. Now, the last couple of words were, it's enough, Joseph, my son is alive. I'm going to go see him before I die. And so Israel took his journey with all that he had, and he came to Beersheba, and he offered sacrifices to the God of his father, Isaac. It does seem at the end of chapter 45, once Jacob was convinced this was the real deal, he wasted little time in getting the troops together and heading south. He wanted to see his son. When he arrived, though, notice in verse 1 at Beersheba, at the edge of the desert wilderness, all of the brakes were put on hard and fast. You would expect him to just keep moving as quickly as possible, but this was an important place for Jacob. There were great memories here of how Jacob had grown up as a child with his father Isaac and with his grandfather Abraham. And it seems that fear and that longing to know the heart of God stopped him in his tracks. Emotionally, let's get to Joseph now. But Jacob was learning and had learned, that God doesn't always work that way. And now he's on his move towards Egypt. And years earlier, the Lord had said to him, "You stay out of Egypt." And now he's running there in some Egyptian carts. Old Jacob knew what to do. Grandpa Abraham had run to Egypt and it had caused havoc. Sarah had brought back a servant named Hagar, and the Middle East had never been the same. Lot had brought back a taste of Egypt and really would never lose it in his heart. Abraham had looked foolish, his grandpa, being rebuked by a Pharaoh of all people. And even his dad had gone there when there was trouble and had used the same ploy. So here's Jacob, old guy, on the border town with Egypt. There was an axiom in the Old Testament from Dan to Beersheba, from the north to the south. Jacob stops and he seeks God. He stops at a time when emotionally I think he'd have just, let's go. Keep driving. It's been too long. And notice the word sacrifices here in verse 1. There are three main sacrifices in the Old Testament law, which is years to come yet. One of them was a sin offering. And a sin offering, you put your hand on the head of an animal, confessing your sins, transferring them to him, and then that animal was killed, and that blood would become a kofar, a covering for you that would allow you then to approach a holy God. So you could come in the Old Testament to God's presence. In the New Testament, obviously, Jesus becomes the way that you lay your hands upon him. He dies for your sins. He takes your sins, and because of his blood, you come into God's presence. He's the Lamb of God who alone can restore fellowship with God. So that was sin offering. That always came first. A burnt offering was a sacrifice of consecration. I won't say concentration, but consecration. And you would bring a whole animal, and that whole animal would be consumed in the fire before the Lord. And it was one of those offerings of fellowship where you just kind of gave everything to the Lord. It was submitting to the Lord. Jacob would have been asking the Lord, I want your will. My will is driven by my emotion. Do you really want me to go to Egypt now? And it's the first time in many times, and notice you read the word Israel. It is Jacob governed by God's Spirit. And then there is a peace offering. And in peace offering, at least in the Old Testament, when you brought the animal, you only burned the fat of the animal. And then you sat down and had a barbecue. And the Lord would get the fat, and you would get the meat, and you would eat with the Lord and have fellowship with him, eating with the Lord, so to speak. So Jacob seeks to know God's heart in these things, and it's one of those important principles because it does seem like, how could this not be right? With all that had lined up for you to go, how can his boys is alive, there's no food anywhere except in Egypt. He's got an invitation, he's got the latest, Egyptian carts, if you will, from Pharaoh. How could this not be the will of God? And I don't know what Jacob is thinking, but he doesn't want to go without God's blessing and God's direction. And so very circumspectly and very maturely, he asks the Lord, is this his will, though it does seem to be the obvious. And he's afraid. He's afraid about doing it wrong. How do I know that? Because I kept reading. Verse 2 says this, God then spoke to Israel in the visions of the night. And he said, Jacob, Jacob, and he said, here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your fathers. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. And I will go with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hand upon your eyes. And so Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob along with their little ones and their wives in the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry them. And they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and they went to Egypt, Jacob and all of his descendants with him, his sons, his sons, his daughters, and his sons' daughters, and all of his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. So Jacob goes to sleep that night after seeking the Lord. And like always, you seek the Lord for wisdom, God's going to come give it to you. I mentioned it before, and I mentioned it again. Usually in the Bible, when God repeats a name, it's to men, not to women. It seems like men don't listen as quickly. At least my wife tells me that. Now, I have no explanation for how that is, but I think if you'll check it out in the Bible, that's true. It happened more often to men by far. I'm having no luck to define it in my favor, but there it is, okay? So Jacob, we are reading here, verse 3 and 4, is afraid about going forward. He doesn't want to mess this up. This is his boy. And so God directs him, and he gives him some wonderful promises that he will be with him as he goes, that he will bring him back to the land, and Joseph would be there when that time comes. Literally, he will put his hands on your eyes. When you die, he'll be at your side. He'll close your eyes, if you will. And the promise of making a great nation out of them, you remember Abraham in chapter 12 got that same promise from God. I don't know how many of you are on any mailing list from Israel. We're on quite a few of them. But it is interesting that as of right now, there are literally just short of 10 million people in Israel. 9 million of them are Jews. The rest of them are predominantly Arab. In 2021, that was not a good year. Their GDP growth was over 8%. Last year, it was 6.5%. Not bad for a country the size of New Jersey. And they produce roughly $500 billion of project a year. They are fourth in the world exporting citrus, third in the export of flowers, first in the export of technology. I'll make of you a great nation. Well, the Lord has certainly done that. And they survived their latest financial woes because Israel's banks will not loan 80 to 90% of a home purchase to a borrower. They will require 80% down. And they'll give you 20%, which means that most people growing up in Israel save for a house. That's all they do. They want to save for a house. Until then, they live at home or they build onto the home, if you will. Well, notice God gives to Jacob 3 wonderful promises as a result of verse 1. He says, I'm not going to send you alone. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to bring you back into this land of promise. It would, by the way, be 430 years from this point before the boys would come back. And they will go in with 70, and they will come out with 2.5 million. So a lot of things will change here in the next 430 years. And thirdly, like I said, your son will be with you at your death. So we are given this rare instance of an entire nation crossing the border to go to another nation to survive with God's promises and assurances. And it's all that Jacob needed. And the next morning, man, he's back in the cart. Let's go. I love verse 7. It says that the whole extended family went with Jacob. God, may God use you to bring your family to Jesus. You know, he brought everyone with him and had influence. Well, I'm going to skip verses 8 through verse 25. Look how quickly we did that. Well done. The nation is small. Here is their names, and there is a complete list of their names that went with Joseph, or with Jacob, excuse me. We run into genealogies scattered throughout the Old Testament, and they are there for a couple of reasons. The primary one is God wants you to follow the lineage from Adam to Christ. You got to be able to get there from here, and how that his promise continues and through those that he chooses, so that you can see God is faithful, and over thousands of years, that's exactly what he did. The importance is the genealogy of Jesus. Second of all, and for me anyway, whenever I read genealogies, I'm always convinced God doesn't forget a name. There's a lot of names in here I've never heard of, and they don't pop up again in the Bible. It's a one-time mention. It's a one-off. But the Lord knew them. It's one life. It's one soul. No life is small in his eyes, you know. So though we know nothing about them, God knows them all very well. So with Jacob, we're 66 descendants, plus Joseph and his wife and his 2 children in Egypt, or 70 in all. 33 of them came through Leah, one of Jacob's wives, 16 of them through Zilpah, 14 through Rachel, and 7 through Bilhah. Jacob and his wives, minus Rachel who died, 12 sons, 1 daughter, 52 grandkids, 4 great-grandkids. I'm just summarizing what you have in your Bible. Dan had the fewest children, having only 1 son. Benjamin had the most. He had 10 sons already. He's in his mid-20s. That boy is busy. Had he continued that way, he certainly would have been the largest tribe. But some tribal sin later on, and that's for another Bible study, they ended up being the smallest tribe of all. A couple of points I wanted you to point out. Verse 13, or wanted to point out to you, verse 13. The sons of Eshkar were Tola, Peha, and Job, and Shimron. And most Bible scholars believe, and I agree with them, this is probably the Job of your Bibles. Moses would have been his contemporary, and it is believed by many that Moses, who wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also wrote the book of Job. And I think there's some pretty good reasons for that. There's also in Job no mention of an altar, no mention of priests, no mention of sacrifices, and it does put him back in this Genesis-type life, if you will, as well as the ages of the children and how many children you had. So there's a lot of internal proof, I think, but if that's the case, here he's mentioned in verse 13. Also in verse 19, it says, the sons of Rachel, Jacob's wife, and it is a singular term there because this was really his true love. And then if you go all the way down to verse 26, we'll read this. And all of the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. With the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2 persons. So all the people of the house of Jacob went to Egypt were 70. Now, if you go to Acts chapter 7 and you read Stephen's very powerful message to the Sanhedrin before they kill him, he will mention that history records that Jacob came with 75 people to Egypt. And you'll say, oh, where did they come from? Well, if you read a little further, Ephraim had 2 children. Manasseh had 2 children. Ephraim had 1 grandchild. So if Stephen is just reading a little further ahead, 75 is right. I'm just telling you that so you can head off the question later. Or if someone asks you, you can go, yeah, let me tell you how that all worked out. But anyway, verse 27. Verse 28, then he sent, Jacob did, Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen. And they came to the land of Goshen. So Judah now takes the lead, goes ahead, meets with Joseph, gets directions. They don't know where they're going. The best part of the land of Egypt and the land that is most suited for feeding your livestock. Their flocks. They were shepherds. By the way, shepherding, at least in this time, used to be a trade that was prevalent in Egypt, but when the dynasty of the pharaohs came in, they hated it. They saw it as below themselves. And so they loathed it and turned away from it. We read in verse 29, so Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck, and they wept on his neck for a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. Joseph said to his father, to his brother, and to his father's household, I will go up to tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and those of my father's house who are from the land of Canaan have come up to me. And the men are shepherds. Their occupation has been to feed the livestock, and they have kept their flocks and their herds and all that they have. So it shall be when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? Make sure you tell him your servant's occupation has been with livestock from your youth, even until now, both we and those with our father, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Just, that took a turn, if you will, with the rise of the pharaohs. So what a reunion this must have been. Again, sometimes the Lord is so short on reporting. The creation, I'd like to have 100 more chapters. Wanted to know where the aardvark came from. I want to know why the Lord left spiders and snakes. Oh my. I don't need the cockroaches. File. I have more information. But I can't imagine what kind of a reunion this has to have been. And so they get to meet together after 22 plus years in the fertile plains of the Nile Delta known as Goshen. By the way, Goshen is a word that means to draw together. And later it'll be called Ramesses. Ramesses. So if you read it in your secular books, Ramesses, it was named after Ramesses the first and the second. Ramesses means to thunder and destroy because they were really horrible pharaohs, if you will. But Moses, writing later, will define the place for the readers at this time. And so this place now was very productive. Joseph instructs his dad and his brothers, if the Pharaoh asks you what you do, you tell him. Tell him you're shepherds. I know they're despised in the culture. Egypt had, at those days, 7 caste systems. Herdsmen were the lowest ranked. Just right above them were wandering shepherds. And if you couldn't really intermarry in caste systems. So this was a pretty structured and wicked group. So Joseph, I think, sought to keep his people separate from the Egyptians. I think this was God's direction to say, just tell them you're shepherds. No one will have anything to do with you. And it'll keep you over here. And so he put them in Goshen, which was, by the way, the best farming land in the country, but it was also the portion of land that was the closest to Canaan. In other words, if they had to turn around and get out, they were very close to getting back to where God wanted them to be. So it was just kind of over the border, if you will. And as God had told Abraham to sojourn here, they would, for 400 more years after Jacob would die. Jacob could have heard that from Abraham. I'm not sure that he did, but that could have went together in his mind. So I think the Lord kept them from intermingling in the world. It's certainly a good example to us. We're in the world, but we're not to be of the world. You know, we're to be an influence, not to be influenced by it. We're not to sell our souls here. Our souls have been already bought by the Lord. So they would be in the fields and in the plains, but they would be far removed from the urbanized and kind of heathen cities of Egypt. God was protecting them, and I think there's something to be said for that. Verse 29, and when the time drew near, sorry, I'm way past, aren't I? Where did I go there? Back to the other one, I flipped the page. So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen, met with his father. And I love the fact that after 22 years, this powerful man, second in power in the world, just for a long time cries on his dad's shoulder. He could have thrown his weight around, he could have been angry, but he had tremendous respect for his father. It's interesting, you know, when kids are young, their dads can do no wrong. When they get older, dads can do no right. You become very quickly in your kids' eyes dumb and archaic and out of touch. Usually when you get older, you look back and go, oh, their dad was pretty smart. But in any case, this is a pretty cool meeting that so little is said, one verse. But I can't wait to see the video. Chapter 47, verse 1. I think we're going to make it. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they possess have come out of the land of Canaan. They've settled into the land of Goshen. And so he took 5 men from among his brothers and he presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, what's your occupation? And they said, as Joseph had instructed, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. And they said to Pharaoh, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants now have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is very severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let us dwell, or servants dwell in the land of Goshen. So I don't know which 5 brothers Joseph took with him. They say to Pharaoh what Joseph had reminded them to do. And they say the word, we've come to dwell, which is, it's easy to run by it, but the word dwell means to sojourn. It literally means to walk around. It's a word that would suggest we're not planning on moving here. We're just going to hang out here for a while. This isn't permanent. There's a round trip, which is kind of that same picture that we read about the church in Hebrews chapter 11, where we read that, you know, those who say such things plainly say that they're seeking a homeland, because if they weren't seeking a homeland or a city, they might have occasion to return. And so these boys will dwell in Egypt like we dwell in the world, which is what Egypt represents, but we don't belong here, right? We don't adopt the world's religion and superstitions. This is not our home. This is not our home. We're passing through, and we're supposed to be passing through. And so it's sad when you start to feel at home here. I'll tell you what, the older I get, the less I like it here. And the more people I know in heaven. I know more people in heaven than I know here, I think. I don't know if that's good or bad. Just keep stepping up on the line. You're next, you're next, you're next. Okay. Wait here. Anyway. So they weren't planning on staying. We're gonna sojourn here. We're not staying. Good example to us. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Tell them to stay in the land of Goshen. And then he says, if you have any competent men among you, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. And Joseph brought in their father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the years of the life of my fathers in the land of their pilgrimage. And so Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and then he went out from before Pharaoh. The meeting of this I like the picture, old shepherd Jacob, then I suspect is wearing the best outfit Joseph can get him to wear. He's just the kind of guy of the fields, right? I'm sure he was very uncomfortable, and he stands before the king of the world. And then we read something twice. He blesses Pharaoh. It's an interesting picture, because at least in the book of Hebrews, we read, without contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. And it speaks of the priest and of who Jesus is and of who Melchizedek was. And so Jacob, he's a prince with God. Pharaoh is a prince with men. The greater, Jacob, is blessing the lesser, the one who has power upon the earth, but the other one has power in heaven. And I say that to you because you have the same privilege. You are God's kids, and yet you're sent out to a world that doesn't know him. And you bring his word and you bring his love, but as his citizens, you can call the world to a blessing. And that's certainly what we're called to do. Jacob, how old are you? I love the expression, 130 years has been the days of my pilgrimage. His dad had died at 175. His grandpa had died at 180. His great-grandpa, Terah, had died at 205. And then he said, at 130, my days have been few, and they've been evil. Well, few is true. The older you get, the faster time passes. I'm pretty sure of that. I remember, as a ninth grader, how long summer vacation seemed. Now you turn around, you go, it's Christmas again, it's Easter again, what exactly is happening here? I made a vow to skip birthdays now. I just don't want to count them all. Just every 5 years will be all right. Few and evil. And yet by the grace of God, he is seeing the goodness of God that is covering his wickedness and his sin. I've had a evil life. I've not done well. But here I am standing in the grace and the mercy of God. Great, great attitude. So, verse 11, Joseph situates his father and his brothers and gives them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the lands of Ramesses, which is what it'll be called later, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father and brothers and his father's household with bread according to the number of their families. So Joseph gets to provide for his family as God's will just becomes just clearer by the day. I would think this must have been the most grateful and joyful time for Joseph in his life. For the rest of the book, the rest of the chapter, we turn our attention to Joseph and his dealings with the Egyptians as the second in command. The land of Egypt would not have had any hope without Joseph, and I see it the same way. The world has no hope without Jesus, right? So with the famine in full swing, verse 13, there was no bread in all of the land, for the famine was very severe, and the land of Egypt as well as the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all of the money which was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money had failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, then the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, can you give us bread? For why should we die in your presence? For the money had failed. They had no money left. And Joseph said, well, you can bring your livestock, and I'll give you bread for livestock if your money is gone. And so they brought Joseph the livestock, and he exchanged those for food, and he did that for an entire year. So First, the people had brought their purse, their money. Now they were bringing their possessions. And again, Joseph's a really good administrator. In verse 18, we read, and when that year ended, there came to a next year. That'd be the fourth year of famine. We will not hide from my Lord that our money is gone, and now, Lord, you, Lord, have all of our livestock. There's nothing left of my Lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before you, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we will and our land be servants of Pharaoh. Just give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. And Joseph bought all of the land of Egypt for Pharaoh from every man, because the famine was so severe and everything became Pharaoh's. And as far as the people, he moved them into the cities, brought them in from the outer lying areas, from the borders. Only the land of the priests he didn't buy, for the priests had rationed and allowed it to them by the Pharaoh, and they ate their rations with Pharaoh. Therefore, they didn't sell their land. So they were a privileged kind of class. But again, the second year, they brought their purse, they brought their possessions. Now they brought their property, 3 P's, and the last one, now they brought their person. So they slowly just lost really everything that was of value to them, as this very wicked and idolatrous land was feeling, I think, the pressure of God's hand upon them. Joseph was a businessman. He made equitable arrangements. We read in verse 25 that, I don't want to go that far. I want to go to 18. Did we stop at 18? Yes, verse 18, 19, sorry. So Joseph bought all the land for Egypt. They became Pharaoh's. But as for the people, he moved them in from the cities. And then Joseph said, verse 23, to the people, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Therefore, here's the seed for you. Go sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 20% of it to Pharaoh, and 80% of it you can keep for yourself as seed for the field, and for the seed for your household, and for the food for your little ones. And so they said, you have saved our life. Let us be favored in the sight of my Lord, and we will be the Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it a law in Egypt to this day, a 20% tax, basically. So Joseph made a permanent taxation system in Egypt in the hardest of times, and decided he would charge 20% for the government running everything, and they would keep 80%. I would think, if you are at all aware of where your money goes these days, that 20%, a simple 20% rule would be wonderful. I mean, just go look at how many taxes you pay on California gasoline, or your property taxes. Needless to say, Joseph was a good guy, man. God just used him. Even in the worst of times, he didn't gouge the people. He was fair, and he took care of them, and they were blessed. Verse 27. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen. They had possessions there, and they grew and multiplied exceedingly, and Jacob lived in the land for the 17 years. So that the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, now, if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly with me and truly with me. Don't bury me here in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You can carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial plows. And he said, I will do as you've said. He said, swear to me. And he did. And so Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. Now, he's not going to die yet. We're going to go through 2 more chapters before he does, but actually 3 more. 2 more. But he's close. For the 70 people that came to the land, God began to bless them. For the next 400 years, like I said, they would grow at a rate of about 6% a year. And God's words to Jacob back in chapter 46, I think it's verse 3, about how he was going to make a great nation out of them, that was taking place here as we get near the end of the book of Genesis. For the last 17 years of his life, Jacob enjoyed his son and the peace of the Lord. Joseph, it's interesting, Joseph was 17 when he was sold into slavery. Jacob lived 17 years with him being cared for. And so Joseph was cared for by his dad 17 years, and then he took care of his dad the last 17 years of his life. I guess that should be every child's will to take care of their parents when they get older. Needless to say, Jacob just had one request. I don't want to be buried here. The Lord said we're going back. By the way, Joseph will make a similar request by faith when he's dying. In fact, that will make the list in Hebrews 11 of an act of faith. Joseph, when he's dying, makes mention of the departure of his bones. Give them instruction. Get me out of here. When you leave, I want to go with you, is what he'll say. So the hand under the thigh. If you've been reading your Bible, you've run into this before. Literally, you could substitute cross my heart and hope to die. Swear to me that you're going to do this. It's one of those oath-taking things. You remember Abraham when he sent Eliezer to find a bride for Isaac, he made him do the same thing. Swear to me you won't, go anywhere else. So Jacob is about to go down this road of death, but he didn't want to be left behind. God's plan was to move them back. For the generations that follow, a time to plan, a time to wait upon the Lord. And to be honest with you, these next 400 years should fill their files of waiting for more information. It's a pretty tough time. They'll have questions like, why are we in Egypt? And when will God deliver us? And how come he doesn't answer our prayers? And where's the deliverer he promised? And you want to say, he will. He's coming. He has a plan. Just wait and see. But they don't. It's just a hard time. But Joseph should teach us otherwise. Next week, Lord be willing, we will go through the particulars regarding Jacob and his family. He wants to talk to all of the boys about what comes down the road. And those prophecies are amazing when you look ahead historically to what God wanted to do and had said over the grandkids, over the kids, as God will tell us through them what lies ahead for Israel in the years to come. So I hope you won't miss it. If you read ahead, I think we got, is it the 10th today? I think we got maybe two more weeks. And I think on next communion we'll start Ephesians, if that's all right with you. And then when we finish Ephesians, we'll come back and do Exodus. How about that? We'll just, because it's 200 years in between, so we could wait a little while before we go to the next part. All right, let's pray together. Father, thank you for your word to us. And we do want to learn what it means to let you be the Lord when everything seems out of order. But to be able to say with Joseph, you sold, God sent to save, is a lesson that we can hardly avoid. We need to learn that, God, you have our best in mind. That there's nothing better than your will, nothing better for us than your plans. And if we truly believed Romans 8:28, we wouldn't complain a day in our life. We wouldn't accuse anyone of getting in our way. We wouldn't look angrily at anyone as if somehow they'd interrupted what the Lord wanted to do, because God's going to have his way. It's just we don't always get to see it so clearly. Sometimes, like Joseph, we'll get to look back and see it. Other times, we'll just have to look ahead, and having learned the lesson that you're trustworthy, we'll just have to hang in there. And meanwhile, we'll fill up that file about needing more information. But knowing what you have done, it will never turn us away from following you. We'll be like those who are looking for a city whose maker is God, internally made without hands. May you be encouraged tonight that God is doing something wonderful in your life. And if he has your life, you can certainly rest in the care that he's giving you and the things that he's taking you through. Just rest. Let God be the Lord. And you go and have a time of joy and worship and rest. Do that tonight. Do that tonight before you go to sleep.